The paramedics knew he was dead the moment they arrived at the Sunset Blvd hotel room on March 15, 1970. Little Richard was lying on the floor beside the bed, his sequined jacket still on, his face covered in the makeup he wore even when he wasn't performing, and there was no pulse, no breath, no response to stimuli. They loaded him into the ambulance anyway because that's what protocol demanded, but nobody expected him to make it to the hospital alive. The attending physician at Cedars-Sinai, Dr. Raymond Chen, would later describe what happened next as the strangest case of his 30-year career. Richard arrived at the emergency room clinically dead, no heartbeat, no brain activity, pupils fixed and dilated. Chen began standard resuscitation procedures more out of obligation than hope, expecting to call time of death within minutes. But 40 minutes into the resuscitation attempt, just as Chen was about to give up, Richard's heart suddenly restarted on its own, his lungs filled with air in a gasping scream, and his eyes opened wide with an expression Chen described as absolute terror, like he'd seen something no human should see. The first words out of Richard's mouth weren't a request for help or a question about where he was. He grabbed Chen's coat, pulled him close and whispered, "I was in hell. I heard the music. I was playing forever and I couldn't stop." For the next 7 years, little Richard refused to touch a piano, refused to perform, refused to even listen to his own records, and when he finally spoke publicly about what happened during those 40 minutes he was dead, the description was so detailed, so specific, and so terrifying that people who heard it wished he'd kept silent. Before we continue with this story, if you want to explore the untold chapters of music history's darkest moments, please subscribe to our channel. These investigations require extensive research into medical records, witness testimonies, and archive materials, and your support helps us bring these hidden stories to light. The road to that hotel room. To understand what happened on March 15, 1970, you have to understand where little Richard was in his life at that moment, and how far he'd fallen from the peak of his fame. By 1970, Richard was 37 years old, and had been cycling between rock and roll stardom and religious ministry for 13 years. He'd quit performing in 1957 after the famous airplane incident, returned in 1962, quit again in 1963, returned in 1964, and the pattern continued with decreasing intervals between each cycle. Each time he returned to music, the guilt followed faster, the sense that he was damning himself grew stronger, and the need to escape intensified. By early 1970, Richard was performing again but barely holding it together. His shows were erratic, his behavior increasingly paranoid, and his drug use, which had always been present but manageable, had escalated to the point where people around him were genuinely concerned. He'd been using cocaine heavily since late 1969, telling friends it was the only thing that quieted the constant music in his head, the only way to stop hearing the piano rhythms and vocal lines that played endlessly in his mind, even when he wasn't performing. People close to him noticed he'd started talking about the music as if it were external, as if someone or something else was playing it and he was just hearing it, and the distinction between performing and being forced to perform had blurred completely. The week before the overdose, Richard had been performing at small clubs in Los Angeles, venues far below his stature, places where he should have been a legend but was increasingly seen as a has-been or a cautionary tale. The performances were strange, according to people who attended. Richard would stop mid-song, stare at his hands on the piano keys, and seem confused about where he was. He'd tell the audience he could hear something underneath the music, a bass line or rhythm that wasn't supposed to be there, and he'd ask his band if they heard it too. They never did. Between songs, he'd talk about deals and prices and obligations, rambling statements that didn't quite make sense but carried an undercurrent of genuine fear. One club owner, Marcus Sullivan, remembered Richard coming off stage after a performance on March 12 and saying, "I think I'm going to have to pay soon. I think the bill is coming due." Sullivan had no idea what he meant, assumed it was drug paranoia, and didn't think much of it until 3 days later when he heard about the overdose. On the night of March 14, Richard performed what would be his last show for 7 years at a club called the Whiskey A Go Go on Sunset Strip. The performance was technically competent but emotionally absent, like Richard was going through motions he'd performed so many times they'd become automatic. But during the final song, something changed. Midway through Tutti Frutti, Richard stopped playing, put his hands in his lap, and stared at the piano for almost 30 seconds of complete silence while the band kept playing behind him. Then he put his hands back on the keys and finished the song, but people in the audience noticed his hands were shaking, and when he stood up to take a bow, there were tears running down his face, cutting tracks through his stage makeup. After the show, Richard locked himself in his dressing room for over an hour. His drummer, who was waiting outside, heard him talking to someone, his voice alternating between pleading and angry, but when they finally convinced him to open the door, he was alone. Richard left the club without speaking to anyone, drove to his hotel room on Sunset Boulevard, and at approximately 1:30 a.m., he called a drug dealer he'd been using for the past 3 months. The dealer, whose name was never publicly released but who gave a statement to police after Richard's overdose, said Richard sounded different that night, desperate in a way that went beyond typical addict behavior. Richard offered triple the usual price for an immediate delivery, and when the dealer arrived at the hotel room around 2:15 a.m., he found Richard sitting on the floor surrounded by pages of sheet music that he'd been drawing by hand, the same musical phrases repeated over and over until the paper was nearly black with ink. Richard barely acknowledged the dealer's arrival, took the cocaine, and before the dealer could leave, grabbed his arm and said something the dealer never forgot. "If this kills me, at least I'll be quiet, at least the music will stop." The dealer left, disturbed but not concerned enough to intervene, and approximately 2 hours later, the hotel cleaning staff found Richard unconscious on the floor of his room. The paramedics were called at 4:27 a.m., arrived 6 minutes later, and immediately recognized they were dealing with a fatality. 40 minutes in the void. The medical details of what happened in the ambulance and the emergency room are documented in Richard's hospital records, which remained sealed until 2003 when they were briefly made available to researchers studying near-death experiences. Richard was pronounced clinically dead on arrival at Cedars-Sinai at 4:45 a.m. No vital signs, no brain activity, body temperature already dropping. Dr. Raymond Chen, the attending physician, initiated standard resuscitation protocols, chest compressions, defibrillation, epinephrine injections, but nothing produced any response. At 15 minutes, Chen noted in the records that resuscitation was likely futile. At 25 minutes, he considered calling time of death but continued because one of the nurses, Patricia Owens, convinced him to try one more round of defibrillation. At 40 minutes, Chen had filled out the preliminary death certificate and was about to disconnect the equipment when Richard's heart suddenly restarted without any external stimulus. No defibrillation shock, no injection, no chest compression. The heart simply began beating on its own, strong and regular. Immediately following, Richard's lungs expanded. He gasped in a breath that sounded more like a scream, and his eyes opened. Chen's notes describe Richard's expression as extreme distress, pupils dilated, facial muscles contracted in what appeared to be terror. What happened next was witnessed by Chen, 2 nurses and an orderly, and all 4 gave consistent accounts. Richard sat up violently, grabbed Dr. Chen's coat with both hands and started talking in a hoarse, desperate voice. His first words were not a question about where he was or what had happened. He said, "I was in hell. I heard the music. I was playing forever and I couldn't stop." Chen tried to calm him, to explain that he'd had a cardiac arrest but was now stable, but Richard wasn't listening or couldn't hear him. He kept talking, describing what he'd experienced during the 40 minutes his heart had been stopped, speaking rapidly as if afraid he'd forget the details or as if he needed to get the words out before something stopped him. He described being in a vast dark space with no visible boundaries, no floor or ceiling, just darkness extending infinitely in all directions. But in the center of that darkness was a stage, illuminated by light that came from no visible source, and on that stage was a piano. Richard said he was sitting at the piano, and his hands were moving on the keys, playing Tutti Frutti, not choosing to play it, not deciding to perform, but playing it automatically, his fingers moving through the familiar patterns without any conscious instruction from his mind. He said he tried to stop, tried to lift his hands from the keys, but they wouldn't obey. He tried to stand up and walk away from the piano, but his body wouldn't move. He was locked in place, hands on the keys, playing the same song over and over, and every time the song ended, it started again immediately, no pause, no rest, just the endless repetition of the same 2 minutes and 25 seconds of music. He said he tried to scream, but when he opened his mouth, his voice came out in the falsetto he used for performing, singing the words to Tutti Frutti in the exact tone and inflection he'd used on the original recording. He couldn't speak, couldn't call for help, could only sing the song that had made him famous. Chen administered a sedative at this point because Richard was becoming increasingly agitated, his heart rate spiking, his breathing rapid and shallow. But before the sedative took effect, Richard said one more thing that Chen recorded in his notes and that Nurse Owens remembered verbatim for the rest of her life. He said, "There were things watching me, I couldn't see them, but I could feel them, and they were patient. They were waiting for me to finish, but the song never finished, so they'd never stop waiting and I'd never stop playing." Then the sedative took effect, and Richard lost consciousness. He slept for 6 hours, and when he woke up, he refused to discuss the experience. When Chen tried to ask about what Richard had said in the emergency room, Richard claimed not to remember, said he'd been hallucinating from the drugs and the cardiac arrest, and insisted that nothing he'd said should be taken seriously. But the medical staff who'd been present knew he wasn't hallucinating in the typical sense. His description had been too coherent, too consistent, too detailed to be a simple drug-induced delusion. And more importantly, his terror had been genuine. Whatever Richard had experienced during those 40 minutes, he believed it was real, and that belief was so strong it changed him permanently. 7 years of silence. Little Richard left Cedars-Sinai Hospital on March 18, 1970, 3 days after the overdose, and he didn't perform publicly again until 1977. 7 years of complete silence from one of the most flamboyant, most visible performers in rock and roll history. He didn't give interviews, didn't appear on television, didn't release any new music. He essentially disappeared from public life, and the few people who saw him during this period said he'd changed dramatically. The sequins were gone, the makeup was gone, the pompadour was gone. He dressed in plain clothes, wore no jewelry, and spoke quietly. But the most striking change was his relationship with music. Friends who visited him said there was no piano in his house, no records, no musical instruments of any kind. If music came on the radio, he'd turn it off immediately or leave the room. If someone hummed or sang around him, he'd become visibly distressed and ask them to stop. His younger brother, Robert Penniman, said Richard would wake up screaming several times a week, always from the same nightmare, playing piano in an empty space, unable to stop, his hands moving on their own. Robert said Richard became obsessed with silence, would sit for hours in completely quiet rooms just listening to nothing, and seemed to find peace only in the absence of any sound. The official explanation Richard gave for his retirement, when he gave any explanation at all, was that he'd had a spiritual awakening, that God had given him another chance at life, and he was dedicating himself to ministry and prayer. He enrolled in theology courses, attended church services multiple times per week, and spoke occasionally at religious gatherings. But people who heard him speak at these events noticed he never sang, never played music, and when others sang hymns or gospel songs, Richard would stand silent, lips pressed together, hands clasped tightly in front of him, as if afraid they'd start moving on their own. In 1973, a gospel music promoter offered Richard $50,000 to record a single religious album, no rock and roll, just traditional hymns and spirituals. Richard turned down the offer without explanation. In 1975, the same promoter increased the offer to $100,000, and Richard's response, according to the promoter, was simply, "I can't. If I start playing again, I won't be able to stop." The promoter assumed this was metaphorical, about addiction or temptation, but people close to Richard knew he meant it literally. He believed that if he touched a piano, if he sang into a microphone, if he performed even one song, he would somehow be pulled back into whatever he'd experienced during those 40 minutes in 1970, and the terror of that possibility was stronger than any amount of money or fame. The 1977 testimony. On June 12, 1977, 7 years and 3 months after the overdose, Little Richard walked into the evangelistic Temple Foursquare Church in Los Angeles and asked if he could give testimony at that Sunday's service. The pastor, Reverend William Thompson, recognized him immediately and agreed, assuming Richard would give a standard redemption narrative about finding God and leaving behind the sinful life of rock and roll. But what Richard said that Sunday morning was nothing like a standard testimony. Speaking to a congregation of approximately 200 people, Richard described in detail what had happened during the 40 minutes he'd been clinically dead in 1970. The description was methodical, almost clinical, as if he'd rehearsed it or written it down and memorized it. He described the dark space, the illuminated stage, the piano, his inability to stop playing. He described the sensation of his hands moving independently of his will, the frustration and then terror of realizing he had no control over his own body. He described trying to scream and hearing his performance voice instead, singing lyrics he'd sung 10,000 times before but never thought about, never analyzed, and now had to repeat infinitely with perfect attention to every syllable. And he described the presence of something watching him from the darkness beyond the stage, something he couldn't see but could sense with absolute certainty. He said this presence was patient and expectant, waiting for something, and he understood instinctively that it was waiting for the song to end. But the song never ended, it just repeated, and so the presence kept waiting, and Richard kept playing, locked in a cycle that felt like it had been going on for years, even though he knew somehow that it had only been 40 minutes. The congregation listened in stunned silence. Some people assumed he was speaking metaphorically, using the language of hell and eternal punishment to describe the psychological torment of addiction. But others, particularly those sitting close enough to see his face and hands, recognized that Richard was describing something he believed had literally happened. His hands were shaking as he spoke, and several times he had to clasp them together to keep them still. His voice broke multiple times, and at one point he had to stop speaking for almost a full minute to compose himself. Near the end of the testimony, he said something that Reverend Thompson recorded in his notes and later shared with researchers. Richard said, "I made a deal 17 years ago. I stood at a crossroads and I said yes to something and I've been paying for it ever since. But that night in 1970 I saw what the full price was. I saw where that deal was taking me, and I've spent the last 7 years trying to figure out if I can break it, if I can stop paying, or if I'm trapped forever." Then he walked off the stage, left the church, and didn't attend services there again. Reverend Thompson tried to follow up with Richard, tried to offer spiritual counseling or support, but Richard refused all contact. The testimony was recorded, the church recorded all its services, and the tape exists in their archives. Portions of it have been transcribed and quoted in books about little Richard's life, but the full audio has never been publicly released, reportedly because Richard's estate has requested it remain restricted. The return and the pattern. In late 1977, little Richard started performing again. The official explanation was that he needed money, that 7 years without income had depleted his savings, but people close to him said the truth was more complicated. Richard had tried to break the pattern, tried to walk away from performing permanently, but something kept pulling him back. Not financial pressure, not desire for fame, but something else, something he couldn't quite articulate but that felt compulsory, like a debt being called in. His first performance after the 7-year hiatus was at a small club in Atlanta, and witnesses said he looked terrified the entire time. He played a shortened set, maybe 40 minutes, standard rock and roll numbers, but his hands were shaking on the keys, and several times he stopped mid-song as if listening to something the audience couldn't hear. After the show, he was asked by a reporter how it felt to be back on stage, and his answer was strange. "It feels like I never left. It feels like I've been playing the whole time, and this is just where people can see it now." The reporter didn't understand what he meant, assumed it was a poetic statement about music being eternal or always living inside him, but people who'd heard the 1977 testimony recognized the reference. Richard believed he'd been performing continuously since 1970, that the experience during those 40 minutes had never really ended. It had just become invisible, happening in some other layer of reality while he went about his normal life, and returning to actual performing was just making visible what had always been happening. Over the next 43 years, from 1977 until his death in 2020, Richard continued performing intermittently, but the pattern had changed. He no longer cycled between performing and ministry in the old way, returning to the church to seek forgiveness or escape. Instead, he performed when he had to, as if fulfilling an obligation, and spent the rest of his time in relative quiet, avoiding music as much as possible while still being a musician. He rarely gave interviews, and when he did, he was careful not to discuss the 1970 overdose or what he'd experienced. But occasionally, usually late in interviews when he was tired or had let his guard down, he'd say things that referenced it obliquely. In a 1984 interview, he said, "Every time I sit at a piano, I'm not sure if I'm playing it or if it's playing me. In a 1995 interview, he said, "The stage is my prison and my job, and I can't quit either one." And in a 2009 interview, one of his last, he said, "I died once and I found out that death doesn't stop the performance. The performance goes on and you're still there, still playing forever." The interviewer asked what he meant, and Richard refused to elaborate, changed the subject and ended the interview early. What actually happened? So what really happened during those 40 minutes little Richard was clinically dead? There are several possible explanations, and which one you believe depends on what you're willing to accept about consciousness, death, and reality itself. The medical explanation is straightforward. Richard experienced a near-death hallucination, a common phenomenon when the brain is deprived of oxygen. The imagery, the stage, the piano, the endless repetition came from his subconscious processing his fears and guilt about his career through the filter of his religious beliefs about hell and punishment. The fact that he described playing Tutti Frutti specifically makes sense because that was the song that made him famous, the turning point of his career, and thus symbolically the source of both his success and his conflict. The experience felt real to him because near-death hallucinations often do, and the trauma of dying and being resuscitated combined with his existing anxiety about performing created a psychological block that manifested as his 7-year retirement. This explanation accounts for everything without requiring belief in anything beyond established neuroscience and psychology, but it doesn't quite explain the specificity of Richard's description, the consistency of his story over decades, or the genuine terror that people close to him observed. If it was just a hallucination, why did it affect him so profoundly for the remaining 50 years of his life? The religious explanation, which Richard himself seemed to believe or at least reference, is that he literally experienced hell, or a preview of hell, during those 40 minutes. From this perspective, the overdose and cardiac arrest created a temporary separation of soul from body, and Richard's consciousness went to the destination his choices had earned. Eternal performance, eternal repetition, eternal payment for the deal he'd made at the crossroads in 1953. The fact that he came back, that his heart restarted and his consciousness returned to his body, was either divine mercy or the deal not being complete yet, him still having earthly obligations to fulfill before the final reckoning. This explanation aligns with Richard's religious worldview and accounts for why he took the experience so seriously, why it changed his behavior so dramatically, and why he spoke about it in explicitly spiritual terms. But it requires belief in a supernatural reality, in souls and hell and cosmic justice, and there's no way to prove or disprove it. The experience was subjective, internal, and unverifiable by anyone except Richard himself. There's a third explanation, one that falls between the purely material and the purely spiritual, and it's the one that makes the most sense to people who've studied Richard's life in depth. Maybe what Richard experienced was the psychological truth of his existence made manifest in hallucinatory form. He'd spent 17 years from 1953 to 1970, performing under conditions that felt compulsory, unable to stop even when he desperately wanted to, cycling between performing and fleeing performance in a pattern that never resolved. The stage was his prison, music was his obligation, and he could never simply walk away because economic necessity, public expectation, and his own sense of identity as Little Richard all demanded that he keep performing. The 40-minute experience wasn't hell in a literal theological sense, but it was a psychological truth expressed in symbolic form. This is what your life has been. This is what your life will be, an endless performance from which there is no escape. The terror came not from experiencing something supernatural, but from seeing his actual existence clearly, without the distortions of fame or rationalization or denial. And the reason it changed him permanently was because you can't unsee that kind of truth. Once you've recognized that you're trapped, that the performance is mandatory and eternal, you can't pretend otherwise even if you continue performing. The final years and the unresolved question. Little Richard continued performing on and off until 2013, when he gave his last public concert at the age of 80. He spent the last 7 years of his life in relative seclusion, living in Tennessee, rarely giving interviews or making public appearances. He died on May 9, 2020, at age 87, from bone cancer. According to his brother, Richard's final days were consumed by the same fear that had followed him since 1970, that death would not free him from the performance, that whatever he'd experienced during those 40 minutes would be his eternal reality. His last words, according to family members present, were a prayer asking God to free him from the stage, to let him rest, to end the music. Whether that prayer was answered, we'll never know. What we do know is that little Richard spent 50 years from the 1970 overdose until his death, living with the memory of those 40 minutes when his heart had stopped and he'd experienced something that either was hell or felt indistinguishable from it. And that memory shaped every choice he made, every performance he gave, every attempt he made to escape the cycle that had defined his life since 1953. The question that remains unanswered is whether Richard's experience was unique to him or representative of something universal. Was he the only performer who felt trapped by his persona, imprisoned by the expectations of fame, unable to stop performing even when performing felt like damnation? Or was he just the only one honest enough or traumatized enough to describe it explicitly? There are other stories, other musicians who've hinted at similar feelings. The sense that fame creates a performance that becomes mandatory, that your public self consumes your private self, that you become trapped in a cycle of expectation and obligation that you can never escape. But none of them described it as vividly or as terrifyingly as little Richard did in that hospital room in 1970 and that church in 1977. He gave voice to something that might be the central horror of fame, that success means never being allowed to stop, that the performance becomes eternal, and that the stage, whether literal or metaphorical, becomes a place from which there is no exit. If hell exists, maybe it's not fire and brimstone. Maybe it's just doing the same thing forever, unable to stop, unable to change, locked into a pattern that once felt like freedom but has become the most complete prison imaginable. Maybe hell is getting exactly what you wanted and discovering that what you wanted was a trap. And maybe little Richard, during those 40 minutes in 1970, saw that truth so clearly that he could never unsee it, and the rest of his life was just him trying to live with knowledge that most people never have to confront, that the price of fame might be your eternity,